And this is the reason why I'm more than happy and glad to properly welcome Thomas Gauthier, Professor and Associate Dean for Pedagogy in the Anthropocene at emlyon Business School. I had the chance to meet Thomas in the last years, and I really appreciate the kind of endeavor he's delivering in making our world more livable, if you would. That at the end of the day is one of the main goals is addressing in his own research. And this is the reason why I'm more than curious in listening the talk that is going to perform, titled When Strategic Foresight Meets Planetary Boundaries. In the previous occasion, and more specifically during the kickoff, we have reinforced the idea that system thinking is more than needed when you're dealing with future. And this is the reason why I strongly believe that the perspective that Thomas is going to share with us will be more than relevant and useful, even for the kind of activities we'll come in a while in the observatory. Let me conclude this very short introduction. On the one hand, thanking Thomas for accepting our invitation, but also in order to share with you the rule of the game that will work not only for the first talk, but even for the two that will come afterwards. And more specifically, you will be more than welcome in making questions to Thomas as well as to the guests that will come afterwards, in relying on the different channels that you may prefer. On the one hand, we are going to put in the chat the address to a web-based platform that you can use in order to introduce your question during the speech, and consequently take notes, if you would, about the curiosity that you may have in relation to the talk. But then even more straightforward, at the end of the talk, during properly the Q&A, you will be more than allowed to simply open your mic and consequently directly give the question to the speaker, as you wish, essentially. So, Thomas, I hope that you are able to properly listen to us, and my introduction was clear enough. I'm going to leave to you the floor, both in terms of the screen as well as in terms of the voice. And I will be back at the end of the talk in order to share with you a few questions that may arrive from our audience. So welcome from my side, but also on behalf of Politecnico di Milano, to Thomas Gauthier.
And thank you very much, Claudio, for the invitation. I hope that you can all hear me okay. And,
yeah, but we can.
I hope that you will, at least to some extent, appreciate my strong French accent in the upcoming 20 minutes. I am going to share my screen. Please bear with me. This is the very first time that I am going to go through this material. I was still working on it 1 hour before today's talk. This is experimental. This is a new line of thinking which builds upon the last 10 years, 15 years or so that I have been teaching and researching on scenario planning and foresight and futures thinking. I am not sure that what I am going to share with you, I will keep on sharing it with others, because I first would like your feedback, your questions, your comments, and I hope it will at least steer our imagination to some extent. So I am going to share my screen, which should now appear on your side. I have a hard time switching to full screen, but I've made the window as big as possible, and you will see I have very little text in my slide anyway.
That's fine. That's fine.
The title has slightly changed, but the topic overall is the same. Why the future must be brought back inside the box is what I want to talk to you about. Here is the sequence that we are going to go through together. First, an introduction, why offering that the future must be brought back inside the box. A first part on how organizations like companies have come to become engines of imagination. Here I'm using the words of Jens Beckert. And also how organizations have learned to ignore limits, first and foremost planetary limits or planetary boundaries. In the subsequent part, I'm gonna make the assumption and test the hypothesis with you that we've come to a point where the future actually harms. Promissory futures in a world beyond limits hurt companies, hurt society, hurt individuals. In the next part, thinking prospectively inside planetary boundaries, I am going to offer a few suggestions regarding how we might correct for this harm. And then I'll conclude with a single slide. The title is rather easy to understand. The future will not save us, but probably our decisions and actions in the present might more surely do so. So let's dive into the introduction. I hope you still see my screen. Well, the talk today is about why imagination must change, and also why the futures we create need to come back inside the box, and the box here being nothing less than the Earth biophysical limits. My next claim here is that never in history have we produced so many futures. We have net zero roadmaps, we have AI transformation visions, we have nature positive strategies, we have moonshot programs and projects. The future has in a way become a product, sometimes a performance, and sometimes a branding device. But unfortunately, and again, this is to be debated, this is to be criticized, the more futures we produce, the less compatible they are with the Earth system that must, the systems that must sustain them. So we have a quantity of futures rising, but we have their ecological viability collapsing. Then the main argument of the talk is rather straightforward. Our dominant mode of imagining the future has become ecologically impossible. We tend to imagine as if limits didn't matter, and so to regain traction on reality, we must learn how to think inside the box. And of course, you have all recognized that thinking inside the box is the contrary to the world famous thinking outside the box. So I'm advocating for thinking inside the box today. In organizations, again, such as companies, but also public agencies and perhaps also supranational bodies, the futures serve political and managerial function. They reassure investors and also stakeholders. They maintain confidence in growth. They externalize responsibility into later decades. And crucially, they assume planetary stability. Now, science tells us that the Earth system is no longer stable, that we cannot keep imagining futures that the planet cannot carry. So we're getting to a point where organizational futures soothe institutions but mislead societies. Is again the first point I am making with you today. So with that being said, I propose a shift with three components. One is to diagnose how organizations became engines of imagination detached from limits. Then to expose how promissory futures, which are futures full of promises, are now harmful. And last, to rebuild imagination by rooting all foresight and strategy inside planetary boundaries. This is not, in the end, about imagining less. This is about imagining differently. Now, to understand how we got here, how we got to these organizations being engines of imagination, we need to reconstruct the history of organizational imagination, how strategy, how foresight, how innovation and future making became central to modern institutions. And we need probably to remind ourselves as well that organizations did not always imagine futures the way they do today. So in the mid-20th century, we started by planning. Then we forecasted, then we built scenarios, and then we turned imagination into a management competency. I quoted Jens Beckert earlier. He calls firms engines of imagination. They produce fictional expectations that coordinate economic behavior. Now, the problem is that these fictions always assumed a stable, abundant, and forgiving planet. In other words, future making has always been evolving without ecological realism. Now, altogether, consultants and futurists and think tanks have built an industry around futures, and that industry rewards what sells, which is to be expected. And what sells is boldness, optimism, and limitless possibility. So thinking outside the box has become a mantra, while the box, the biosphere, was forgotten. And here's the deal. Our culture of innovation essentially trains us to ignore limits. Future help organizations to coordinate under uncertainty. I've spoken to this earlier. They motivate teams, they attract capital, and they help justify decisions. But they have, in a way, drifted into plain fiction. And the reason is that in competitive environments, the future that wins is rarely the most realistic. The future that wins is the most compelling. And this logic systematically pushes imagination away from ecological truth. Futures have, said differently, become stories optimized for persuasion, not for feasibility. The futures are also ambivalent, and as a matter of fact, they can open our eyes as much as they can close our eyes. They can be a lens, but they can also be an opiate. And in this era of planetary boundaries being breached, this ambivalence is becoming dangerous. And once again, futures simultaneously inspire and blind. That's the catchphrase I'm hoping that you would take home with this particular slide. Let's turn to the darker side of how future making becomes harmful in a world beyond limits. Promissory futures, again, such as net zero 2040, nature positive 2050, and the likes, they create the illusion of direction. But meanwhile, many of them end up delaying action. They push transformation into a temporal safe zone, which is always a few decades ahead. In a way, they calm the present instead of challenging it. And in the end, a promised future is often a postponed present. Continuing on, scenario planning began in oil companies and defense in the second half of the 20th century, and back then, the purpose was essentially to preserve business continuity under geopolitical uncertainty. And to date, this DNA still runs through corporate foresight. By and large, futures are crafted to protect the organization and certainly not to transform the world. Alice Comi, our colleague, and other colleagues more recently showed that without value-based inquiry, futures merely reproduce the status quo. In a nutshell, you see this on the screen, futures often serve power, not possibility. Now, hope can become ideology, innovation can become anesthesia, and narratives of salvation can become denial mechanisms. When we imagine that technology will fix everything later, we just avoid asking what we must change now. Futures can function as sophisticated forms of denial. Now, harmful futures, they share 4 traits. First, deferral, which means that the hard stuff is always later. Then depoliticization, whereby conflict becomes a technical challenge. And then domestication, which means that radical ideas are tamed. And then probably a fourth and final trait would be that harmful futures carry delusion, whereby ecological boundaries disappear. And these pathologies are now embedded in organizational future-making practices. The future industry produces systemic illusions. Now let's turn to the constructive part of this presentation. I said there would be a few parts. Now we're getting into the constructive part, the central contribution, hopefully, which is concerned with how to rebuild imagination so that it becomes ecologically truthful and strategically useful. Now, on September 30th and October 1st of this year, the Alternative Futures Workshop, which took place in Lyon, in France, emphasized one thing clearly, which is that strategy must confront the destabilizing reality of the Anthropocene. We have scientists reporting that 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries are crossed, and so now futures must fit inside that reality, or they can't be anything else than irrelevant and more critically harmful fictions. To put it differently, the Earth system must now be the starting point of strategy. Now, to think inside the box means embracing 3 principles that we could debate together if you so desire. Number 1, starting with science and acknowledging the boundaries that define viability. Then integrating foresight, strategy, and systems changes. And last, selectively closing or eliminating futures that are ecologically impossible. So here, it's probably worth remembering that constraints are not limitations, but rather conditions for truth. The approach opens 3 possibilities. Number 1, material transformation, where actions are grounded in reality. Number 2, repoliticization of time in such a way that the future stops being an escape. And last but not least, coordination across systems, recognizing that no organization can stay inside boundaries alone. Inside the box thinking, you see this on the screen, produces futures that can be lived. The reorientation I therefore present to you and also possibly advocate for is from unbounded imagination to constrained creativity, from desire to feasibility, from infinite possibility to viable possibility, and from escapism to responsibility. When imagination re-enters the box, well, it probably becomes powerful again. And so as a conclusion, this is my final slide. The future will not save us. What might save us is the courage to begin imagining differently and to anchoring all our futures inside the limits of what I consider to be the only world that will ever hold us. Thank you all very much for your attention.